Sister Superior Ephrael Stern is easily one of 40K's most mysterious and controversial characters. Now, at first glance, she might seem like just another Sister of Battle, but looks can be deceiving. You see, after absorbing the faith and memories of 700 fallen sisters, Stern became a psychic force of nature. Condemned as a witch, she was cast out of her order, hunted across the galaxy by the Inquisition, and feared by chaos itself. If you're unfamiliar with her, she first appeared in the Demonifuge comic book line of the late 90s, something I covered in a previous video if you're curious about her origins. But the series ended abruptly and on a huge cliffhanger. Most fans assumed that that was the end of her story and she most likely got written out of the canon, until Games Workshop surprised everyone by bringing her back in 2020 with a full-length novel titled The Heretic Saint, just in case, the Living Saints wasn't metal enough for you. The last time we saw Stern, she and her Harlequin companion Cogonel had just defeated a Calexis assassin and narrowly escaped from Ordo Malleus, disappearing into a webway portal in search of the legendary Black Library. By all accounts, after this, she completely vanished from Imperial records. But now it's 100 years later, in the dark sectors of Imperium Nihilus, where apparently she's still fighting for mankind, holding back demonic incursions and searching for answers about her nature and the will of the Emperor. But things are not going well. She's kind of having a crisis of faith. Once she used to receive visions from the Emperor, but since the opening of the Great Rift, those visions have stopped. Her prayers are going unanswered. For the first time, Stern begins to doubt. Has the Emperor abandoned her? Or worse, is he truly gone? And every time she goes to pray, she senses something else. Something vast, silent, and utterly alien. A hunger that threatens to consume the entire galaxy. She doesn't know what it is, only that it's getting closer. And no, before you ask, it's not the Tyranids. This book was absolutely buck wild. If you thought Stern was powerful in the Demonifuge comics, she's now on a totally different level. Turns out fighting armies of demons nonstop by yourself for 100 years is exactly what it takes to reach peak performance! In this video, we're going to be covering the entire novel, and I'm going to be abridging large portions of it and just telling you what you need to know. This is a story of betrayal and redemption, of heretics and saints, and most importantly, the power of faith in the grimdark future. But before we dive into it, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Into the AM, makers of some of the best graphic tees that you can get on the internet. Now, if you know me, you know I'm a huge fan of their shirts, and I wear them pretty much every day. At this point, I think I own like 20 or 30 of them. They're stylish, comfortable, and the best part, like 20% longer than a normal t-shirt. Not enough to look out of place, but just enough that it doesn't rise up every single time you lift your arms up. My fellow big and tall homies know exactly what I'm talking about, but for you short and skinnies and the rest of you regular shape folks, here's a demonstration. Perfection. If that wasn't good enough, they're also shrink and fade resistant. My oldest Into the AM shirt is pushing 3 years at this point, and it looks just as good as the day I bought it. And there's never been a better time to try some of them out for yourself, as Into the AM is having a huge sale right now, where you can save up to 60% off site-wide. Now that deal's crazy enough as it is, but my listeners can save an additional 10% off their entire order when you use my link in the description down below or coupon code WesHammer at checkout. So what are you waiting for? Elevate your style today by clicking on the link in the description or use code WesHammer at checkout to save 10% off your entire order. Big thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring this video. Our story begins aboard the battlecruiser the Iadex Ferox, and it's here that we find Lord Inquisitor Otto Dagover, a heavily augmented and ancient Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos. He was tracking rumors of a powerful force fighting against the ruinous powers. Dagover had spent over a century navigating through Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy that has existed since the opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum. He has spent this time hunting a warrior, a legendary figure of myth whose actions suggest that the Emperor still protects. He had been following a pattern of worlds where chaos incursions had been mysteriously repelled, each victory leaving behind renewed faith and hope, which was a rare commodity in the failing Imperium. Arriving in orbit above the shrine world of Parastus, his crew detected signs of a massive battle, with warp-tainted energy lingering in the atmosphere. Parastus appeared to be the next site of this mysterious warrior's campaign. The battlefields formed something of a ring instead of a random pattern, which suggested an intentional attempt to hold back chaos. This strategic approach strengthened Dagover's belief that his search was finally nearing its end. Now, as he studied the hololithic scans, his officer expressed awe and certainty. Ephrael Stern was here. The heretic saint, the demonifuge, the thrice-born being of sacred terror whispered about in myth was on Parastus. Whether she was salvation or damnation, Dagover was determined to find out. Ephrael Stern flew over Parastus, the land beneath her being torn apart by war and volcanic eruptions. The once holy monuments were crumbling, consumed by fire and destruction, but she had faith that the shrine of Saint Celestine still stood atop the highest peak. Stern was determined to reach it, convinced it held something vital. As she soared towards the shrine, the land itself seemed to resist her, shifting violently as if chaos sought to deny her passage. The air grew hotter, warning systems in her armor blared, and the sky darkened with unnatural forces. The corruption of the ruinous powers was absolute. Demons of various kinds began to be drawn to her presence and attempted to stop her. Stern pressed forward, undeterred, cutting through the enemy with her sheer will and psychic power. She destroyed several warp-spawned horrors, their screams drowned out by the planet's upheaval. The battle was fierce, but she fought for something more than just survival here. It was for a purpose greater than herself. Finally, she reached her goal. The shrine of Saint Celestine still stood, though it was surrounded by enemies. At its center was a monstrous great unclean one. It taunted her with vile words and a promise of corruption, but Stern refused to be swayed. She battled the demon and eventually managed to emerge victorious. With the great unclean one slain, Ephrael Stern surveyed the destruction around her. The demon's corpse dissolved into putrid sludge. The shrine of Saint Celestine, once a holy bastion, was crumbling, and Stern felt no triumph, only a deep and growing hollowness. Her faith had sustained her through impossible battles, yet in this moment, she felt abandoned. Her victory over the demon should have been proof of the Emperor's will, but instead she was filled with doubt. Where was his voice? Where was his guidance? For all her efforts, the Imperium continued to crumble, and she fought alone, a warrior cut off from the army she was meant to serve. Determined to finally find some clarity, she entered the tomb, hoping for some type of revelation. She knelt before the saint's relic, her skull that had been preserved with a golden reliquary, and prayed for a sign. But when she reached out to touch the skull, it crumbled to dust. There was no vision, no divine message. Her only answer was silence. Now, the weight of this moment broke something in Stern. She had fought for over a century, driven by the belief that the Emperor still watched over her. But now, for the first time, she had to confront the possibility that no visions would ever come again. No blessings of purpose, no guidance to show her how to fight for an Imperium that believed she was a monster. She cried out with all of her soul. Her psychic identity reached out for the dream currents of the warp. Abandoned, she accepted her punishment and embraced the nothingness that awaited her. She would not seek past it any longer. She would not delude herself into thinking forgiveness would come. She had been arrogant without knowing it, prideful to believe that her path had been so clearly and irrevocably delineated. Then, a great nothing came for her. Her breath froze, silencing her cry. The nothing moved. The nothing advanced on her. Now, this blackness was something more than just mere absence. It was a monstrous presence. It was suffocating, smothering, a total blank, yet a blank that had something close to substance. It was active. This was not about her penance or her sin. This thing, this nothing, was not aimed at her. It was terrible, all-encompassing. The totality of the nothing showed her a truth so awful that she had never contemplated its possibility. The Emperor and his Imperium were not simply ignoring her prayers. They were gone, destroyed utterly and completely. There could be no other explanation for such a complete and utter void. Stern fell to her knees, grieving not just for herself, but for the Imperium, for humanity, for the death of everything that once gave her purpose. She screamed in despair, but the universe did not answer. Darkness, a great annihilating void, was approaching. Whatever it was, it had swallowed the Emperor and his Imperium. The tombstone marking their grave, the great rift that split the galaxy in half. But the nothing was not done. It was still hungry. It was closing in. It would not be done until the galaxy in its entirety was devoured. Perhaps it would not be satiated even then. Nothing was coming, and it brought a final, endless, empty night. But Stern would not surrender. If the Emperor was no longer there to guide her, she would continue to fight on without him. She would not let the Nothing claim the galaxy without resistance. With her pain transmuted into resolve, she donned her helm and rose once more, taking flight and leaving the shrine behind. Ephrael Stern was alone, but she was not finished. Sometime later, the Lord Inquisitor from before and his squad landed on Parastus, near a towering sepulchre. Now, he hadn't been entirely sure what he would find on the planet's surface, but it certainly wasn't this. There was no combat raging. The planet seemed utterly silent, save for the remorseful wailing of thousands of penitent heretics. Through scarification and exposed flesh, they bore the marks of chaos, but now they seemed to be in mourning. They were flagellating themselves, carving statues of demons frozen in the moment of defeat. All of them were turned towards the massive sepulchre, abasing themselves and begging forgiveness. Whatever they had witnessed must have been beyond terrifying to cause such an unnatural shift from devotion to complete remorse. Dagover noted something else as well. There were no corpses amongst them. This was not fear of retribution. It was awe. Awe at its most fearful. They approached the sepulchre. Its massive walls were adorned with imagery of mourning and penance. He hesitated at its gate, observing the heretics refusing to cross an unseen boundary, as if whatever lay beyond filled them with more terror than the wrath of the Chaos Gods themselves. He, however, was determined to uncover the truth, so he entered the sepulchre alone, leaving his squad behind. When he got inside, he found a vast, eerie crypt, filled with ancient tombs and the relics of forgotten centuries. Dust hung in the air like fog, and every step echoed as if disturbing something sacred. As he ventured deeper into the structure, he sensed a presence, something powerful, something beyond comprehension. Despite the lack of direct evidence, he had never been more certain of anything in his long career. Ephrael Stern awaited him. However, he didn't really make it very far inside before being confronted by Kaganel, a Harlequin warrior who had been Stern's ally and closest companion for years. The alien watched him warily and eventually interceded his path. He questioned Dagover's intentions, every movement balanced with coiled tension. The Inquisitor, unfazed, insisted he needed to speak with Stern, and it was at that moment that Stern descended from above, wreathed in crackling psychic energy. Her presence was overwhelming. Her eyes glowed with raw power, and for an instant, Dagover felt something he had not experienced in centuries: fear. She regarded him with cold detachment and warned that he should not have come here. But Dagover didn't flinch. Instead, he greeted her with reverence, addressing her as Thriceborn, a title that surprised her. Unlike the many other Inquisitors who had hunted her before, he did not come with accusations of heresy or threats of execution. Instead, he claimed to have been searching for her for over a century. Stern was suspicious and challenged him. Why, she asked, and Dagover's answer was also unexpected. He said, because the Imperium needs you. She was unmoved by this and tells him that the Imperium was gone. Dagover shook his head. He didn't believe that. He believed that it was wounded, but it definitely wasn't gone. She studied him carefully. She had heard those words before, from zealots, from desperate men clinging to a fading dream. But Dagover was different. His faith was unshaken, his conviction absolute. He didn't offer her absolution or reconciliation with the Adeptus Sororitas, nor did he claim she needed to prove herself. Instead, he spoke as one who knew the truth of her power and believed that it must be used. Stern, however, remained defiant. She asks if he thinks that she is just some type of weapon for him to wield. With a sigh, Dagover acknowledged that had been his first intention. But over the long years, after having witnessed the effects of her actions, entire worlds renewed in faith simply by her presence, he now believed she was more than just a weapon. She was a sign that the Imperium could still fight back. Still skeptical, Stern called Kaganel to her side. She challenged him further. She said, if you are Ordo Xenos, then the friendship you see before you now is blasphemous and must be destroyed. Does my ally disgust you? Or have his kin already been made into your trophies? She gestured at his cloak, which was evidently made from the skins of many different Xenos species, the Eldar included. He didn't deny the inherent hypocrisy, nor did he react with hostility. I come before you as I am, he said, so there can be no secrets between us. Unlike my colleagues, I am one who understands the difference between means and ends." He then asked if she was still being pursued by the Inquisitors of Ordo Malleus, to which she nodded. He let loose a sad chuckle, his voice tinged with a dry bitterness. He said, "That is the problem with them. When you're so concerned with being the hammer, everyone starts to look like witches." Some of the things Dagover is saying during this conversation would have gotten him condemned as a heretic by others within the Inquisition. Stern wondered how carefully he chose his words, how deliberate he was with what he revealed. Eventually, she manages to discern that he's no regular old Inquisitor. He's actually a member of the Recongregators, a radical sect of the Inquisition that believed the Imperium had strayed far from the course the Emperor had laid out for it. It had stagnated and reached a dead end. Its adherents believed that in order for the body to survive, its gangrenous and diseased portions would need to be excised without mercy. Although he does confirm the label of a radical, she's not convinced of his benevolent intentions with her and presses forward. She says, "You say you need me, but why me, and for what?" And Dagover doesn't hesitate. He says, "Because the Emperor's will still moves through you." At these words, Stern faltered for the first time. She wanted to believe. She wanted to think that her suffering, her battles, her exile, all of it had meaning. But she could not ignore what she had seen. The void, the nothing that loomed over the galaxy like the end of all things. So she gave him one final test. "You say the Imperium still stands. How do you know this?" Dagover's reply was simple but unshakable, because the alternative was unthinkable. Stern studied him, her mind filled with doubts and contradictions. For over a century, she had fought alone, certain of her place, her purpose. Dagover offered something that she had not had in a long time. A sense that she was part of something greater. At this point in her journey, Stern is having a crisis of faith. From her perspective, the Imperium, and more importantly the Emperor, have either been destroyed or have abandoned her. But this Inquisitor, who like her had been cut off from the Imperium, remained unshakable in his faith. She didn't trust him, not yet, but something about him made her want to believe again. It made her want to hope. He asks her what brought her to this world specifically, beyond the obvious of slaying demons. She says that she had sought the skull of Saint Ephrael, a woman who was once touched by visions from the Emperor. She'd come seeking a miracle, a sign to renew her purpose, but none had come. She explains her true mission to him, that inside of her was the collective knowledge of 700 sisters of the Order Pronatus, and their combined wisdom, gathered over centuries of research into the truth behind chaos, had to be preserved. To this end, she and Cogonel had been searching for the Black Library, the Eldar's hidden trove of knowledge. Hearing this, Dagover raises an eyebrow. That was a Xenos construct. He asks her if she would hide such important information from her own species, but she tells him there was no safer place for it. He asks if she believes that, then why hadn't they gone there yet? The answer was simple: they no longer knew the way. Most of the paths that Cogonel would have used before had since been closed off to him after he was exiled from the Harlequins and became a pariah. For her part, the guiding visions that she had relied on for so long had vanished many years ago. For the longest time, she believed this was because she was tainted by the warp. She was deemed unworthy by the Emperor. However, she had recently had another vision of the Great Nothingness. She's not 100% sure of its nature yet and how much of a threat it represents, but one thing was clear to her: the Emperor and the Imperium were undoubtedly gone. He told her if anyone was unworthy of the Emperor's grace, it was the Imperium itself. It had been for a long time. Further, he believed she was wrong, that the Emperor and the Imperium still stood, and the likeliest reason for her lack of visions was because of the rift blocking them out. Much had changed in the last century. He understood her sense of being lost. His own faith had eroded slowly since the rift opened. More and more of his purpose was chipped away until all that remained was his search for her. Now he believed helping her fulfill her purpose was his own. He told her to come with him. Together, they would fight for the Imperium and the Emperor, for its renewal, in his name and by his will. He believes the fact that they are meeting right here and right now, at this specific moment in her journey, when she needs guidance the most, could not be a coincidence. It was fate. Now, given Stern's history with the Inquisition, it makes sense that at this moment she's still pretty wary of him. Many had sought to use her in the past, and she's not convinced that this Inquisitor is any different. But even if that was true, she desperately wants to believe him. She wants to believe there was another way of interpreting her vision of the nothing. He was here offering her hope, and she wondered if she would be a fool to not accept that. After careful consideration, she eventually agrees and says that they will travel with him. She asks him about the nature of his ship, to which he states that it's a battlecruiser. She asked if it was combat-worthy, and he says that it is, but it's definitely seen better days. She thought of the volcanic wastelands outside and the hordes of wailing damned. There was nothing left on this world to be saved, but there was desecration that could be prevented. She asks him one final question. Is your ship capable of carrying out exterminatus? Dagover regarded her for several seconds, absolutely still. When he laughed, it was the sound of vocal cords scraped over a saw blade. A little while later, we find Stern and Cogonel walking through the sepulchre. She kneels and prays at each of the holy relics that she had managed to save on this world. Cogonel asks her why she is doing this. He understands that in her culture, such objects are seen with great reverence, but to him, gathering them had always been a small diversion from their true objective. She tells him that she saved these when she could, because to leave them to ruin would have been a sin. A tomb of oblivion will now come for all of these relics, and I will give them the respect of a proper farewell. Despite her words, Stern's prayers felt like too little. Nothing she did felt like enough. The emptiness where the sense of the God Emperor had been was too vast, too complete. Even if the Emperor still reigned, that did not change the fact that she had fallen from grace. What act by a mortal could possibly be an atonement? And if the nothing was not what she had believed, then what was it? What terrified her here was the prospect that she had been right all along, and that it was the Inquisitor who was completely deluded with hope. After she had finished kneeling before each and every relic, Stern went with Cogonel to the top of the spire to look out at the repentant masses below one final time. Better a holy cremation than a corrupted existence, Stern said. The people of the Shrine World had abandoned the Emperor, and fear-driven repentance was not enough. None were worth saving. In her soul, she still heard the cultists chanting at the mountain's base, pleading to the dark gods, begging to be spared. Today, she would show them how empty those prayers were. Stern and Cogonel stayed to witness the world's end firsthand. They would be able to leave at any point via a portal. As they waited, they spoke of fate. Stern once believed her purpose was to find the Black Library, but her encounter with the Inquisitor today had changed that. She now sensed her path lay elsewhere and worried what that meant for Cogonel. They both agreed that despite where their future would take them, at this moment, they would both welcome clarity once again. The cyclonic torpedo struck the northern volcanic chain. Day broke like a weapon, blinding in its consuming finality. As the brilliance faded, the roar came, a thunderous end that dwarfed the volcano's fury. A burning wind slammed into the sepulchre spire, cracking it from base to crown. The land convulsed, mountains toppled. The volcanoes merged into a single apocalyptic eruption. Towering fireballs built upon each other until a red wave of lava 20 miles high burst from the world's heart. It swept across the land, drowning shrines in molten ruin. The penitent around the sepulchre would see it and know their final judgment was upon them. Where are your prayers now? Stern raged at the heretics. This is all the forgiveness you deserve. Where the torpedo had hit, the land writhed. Billions of tons of rock evaporated, melted, and twisted in the grip of monstrous tides. Mountains fell, peaks gaped open, parting like a leviathan's jaws. Where demons had held their revels and gathered their armies, there was only the furnace of a dying planet. Soon the lava would reach the sepulchre, and the sanctity of the relics would be preserved by purging fire. Stern hoped her despair would die here as well. With destruction quickly approaching them, Cogonel opened a portal, and together they teleported aboard the awaiting battlecruiser, leaving Parastus to its fiery fate. A little while later, we find them all aboard the ship, and the three of them are discussing what to do next. Quietly to herself, Stern wonders if it had not been for the Inquisitor's urging, would she have reread her destiny so easily? Likely not. She couldn't see any other alternatives. Whatever the truth about the coming nothing, she knew she had to fight it, and traveling with Dagover felt like forging a link to the hope that the Imperium still existed. The exchange that follows in this scene is a philosophical tug-of-war between pragmatic ambition and sacred purpose. The Inquisitor wanted them to completely abandon the search for the Black Library, and instead continue wielding Stern's power in the name of mankind. They had admitted before that when they got to the Black Library, they weren't 100% sure how the Eldar there would manage to get the information out of Stern, and surmised that the process would most likely end in her death. Now, they're not 100% sure of that, but it's a likely possibility that Stern has prepared herself for. Dagover thinks this idea is ridiculous. She had been chosen to wield that power for a reason. To abandon it would be a waste and a sin. Stern and Cognal admit that even though they've always believed the Black Library was their best option, at this point, they know there's no real way forward on that path. Additionally, from Stern's perspective, the all-consuming nothingness that she had sensed was now her top concern. If left unchecked, it would devour the entire galaxy. To this, the Inquisitor agrees, which surprises her. He says that considering all of the other horrific things that have plagued the galaxy over the last century, it would be foolish to assume something even worse wasn't right around the corner. Now, even if they're all kinda sorta on the same page now, they still don't really know what to do next or where to go. Eventually, Stern asks Cogonel if there was any other member of his species that he trusted. Is someone like him, perhaps an exile or an outcast or another pariah? At the very least, is somebody that maybe didn't see eye to eye with the rest of his species. He thinks about it for a moment, and eventually tells her of Yvraine of the Ynari, and as it turns out, he can make a portal to take her there. They make plans to go and meet with her right away, the Inquisitor happily volunteering himself to tag along, and they shut that down immediately. They're like, my dude, you're quite literally wearing a cloak made out of Eldar skins. How exactly do you think that's gonna go over? Dagover is not happy about this, but does concede their point, albeit begrudgingly, and quietly lamenting to himself the missed opportunity for knowledge seldom available to members of his species. A little while later, they end up leaving Dagover's study, and Cogonel opens a portal that the pair steps through, emerging in a massive hall made from Eldar wraithbone. Cogonel warns her to tread carefully here. They were now walking on sacred ground. After a little bit of searching, they eventually locate her, and the exchange between Yvraine and Stern opens with the leader of the Ynari acknowledging that she had sensed Stern's psychic presence even before her arrival. She describes it like a psychic nova, something she had only encountered a handful of times in the past. She asked Stern if she knew the danger she represented. Stern answered simply that she was only a danger to her enemies. But Yvraine, clearly thinking aloud and not fully engaged in the conversation yet, remarks that it was possible that no one truly understood what she was. Not her, Stern herself, or even the gods. Stern and Cogonel both tell her that they had come to warn her of the nothing that was approaching, and to propose an alliance between humanity and the Eldari. Yvraine tells them that she had actually just recently entered into an alliance with the Imperium, and had not expected the necessity of another quite so soon. Stern and Cogonel exchange a look, and they both look pretty confused. So Yvraine clarifies, calmly but with weight. She had been the one to aid in the resurrection of Robutte Guilliman. Hearing those words caused the figurative floor to drop from beneath Stern. She stood there in utter shock. The Emperor's son had returned from the dead. She almost wept. If he was back, then that meant the Imperium still existed in some capacity. And if the Imperium still existed, then the Emperor still watched over mankind. She asks about the Imperium to confirm whether or not it still existed. Yvraine nodded. It did. Not in the best way, she admitted, not since the last time she had interacted with it. But it was still there, on the other side of the rift. This news reignited something in Stern, something she had not experienced in a long time: hope. Eventually, she gets back to the topic at hand. The nothingness was coming, and if they didn't work together, it could be the end of everything. Yvraine asks her if this was a vision that she had had, and Stern confirms that it was. Ironically, she explained that for the last century, she believed she had lost the ability to receive visions. But now, with full clarity, she understood that that wasn't the case. The visions hadn't stopped at all. They had been blocked, smothered by the all-consuming infinity of the nothingness. Yvraine approaches her and gently extends her hands, asking to join with her in psychic communion so she could see the nothing for herself. Stern nodded and grabbed her hand. Stern closed her eyes. She barely had to open herself up psychically. The nothingness rushed to seize her. Her breath stopped. All was black and cold and numb. The blackness was eternal, swallowing stars and souls forever. She could not see its boundaries. It seemed infinite, and to be growing at the same time. Stronger and stronger, finality upon finality, the last of all curtains to fall. Yvraine jerked back from Stern, having seen enough. She said she didn't know what this nothing was, but it was certainly as dangerous as Stern had feared. She told them that when the time came, she would aid them and the rest of humanity. There was, however, one condition. Although Stern's next step in their journey was to seek the source from which the nothing would spread, Cogonel must seek out his former troop of Harlequins and find for Yvraine a solitaire. If he fulfilled this part of the bargain, she would fulfill hers. With that, the meeting came to a close. The pair created another portal, stepping back onto the Inquisitor's battleship and materializing in an empty cargo bay. They realized that the moment had finally come, and this was a poor place for a farewell, but at least they would have their solitude.
"We have walked far together, Thriceborn."
"A journey I could not have made without you,"
said Stern.
"I shall miss your wisdom and your blades."
She smiled.
"It will be challenging to grow used to traveling exclusively by human means again."
The words were banal. Anything she said would be after so many years of companionship. They clasped forearms.
"I will hope our paths cross again,"
said Cogonel.
"I have faith they will,"
Stern said. Everything about their friendship, from its beginning to its duration, was so unlikely that meeting again seemed the least of improbabilities.
"But we move as fate demands."
"We do,"
Cogonel agreed.
"Do you think we have performed well?"
Stern asked, shifting to the Harlequin's idiom, paying tribute and respect to what he had taught her of his ways and faiths. Cogonel smiled.
"Magnificently, especially for so small a troop, so often deprived of an audience, perpetually without the proper one," he said.
"By your side, the art was its own reward."
Cogonel placed a hand over his heart and bowed his head.
"Well said, Thriceborn. It has been the great honor of my path to perform beside you."
"As it was mine to dance beside you."
"Then I bow to you, until the curtains rise to reveal us to one another once more."
"I bow to you, in the same hope."
Stern stepped back, giving Cogonel space to summon his portal to the webway. He gestured, and a frame of air around him shimmered. They looked at each other one last time, holding on to the link of solidarity. Cogonel stepped into the portal. His image shimmered too. Then the air cleared, and he and the portal were gone. She didn't move right away, contemplating the loss of the fellowship of the Xenos she had trusted with her life. She was left with the company of the human she didn't trust at all. When she meets back up with Dagover, she tells him of everything that transpired with Yvraine. Now, Dagover is a little bit disappointed that she didn't have a more practical solution for their immediate objective, but the fact that Guilliman had returned was something that he could barely process. He also says that he has no reason to doubt that it's true. It would be a pretty pointless lie, especially coming from the Ynari. Stern tells him that although she had been doubtful before, she now understood what her purpose was. This darkness was something she had to fight. Her mission might take her even further away from whatever remained of the Imperium than they had been before, and she asks him if he's prepared for that. Dagover answers without hesitation, he was. After the exchange concludes, she spends some time alone in a candlelit room, knelt in prayer, before a small shrine.
"Father of mankind, forgive me for my weakness. Forgive me for not seeing what I should, and for believing that you no longer protected your children. Though I am not worthy of your blessing, I am your servant eternally. Show me what you would have me do. Grant me the wisdom to know how best I must serve you."
When she closed her eyes, however, The darkness once again rushed in. It tried to drag her into an inescapable pit of despair, but this time she resisted. She defied the nothing, claiming it would be defeated.
I will not despair,
she cried in prayer.
My greatest strength is not my own. It is the strength of the God Emperor that will stand against this evil.
It was not for her to see the way. It was for her to believe that she would be shown the way. Her duty was to have faith, and she did. Her belief in the God Emperor sang in her heart. The shrine before her gave her a way to concentrate her thoughts, and powerful as symbols were, it was still just a symbol. Monuments and rituals served their purpose, but they fell away to insignificance before the essence of faith itself. That was what she offered the God Emperor now. She gave herself to the totality of belief. Without reservation, she believed. She became belief. Her identity vanished, yet the darkness could not absorb her, for another had claim over her. And in this state, for a tiny, blessed fragment of eternity, the dominion of the nothingness receded. It had not yet arrived. It had not yet consumed all. And so something came through. A name, a place, a beginning. Severitas. She reports back to Dagover and tells him the name she had had in the vision. He pulled up a galactic map. Severitas lay on the other side of the Great Rift. Reaching it would be dangerous and might not even be possible. They would have to find a way around the rift, and they had no idea how large it really was. But Stern told him he misunderstood. They would be traveling directly through it. Dagover expresses serious concern. The ship's Geller fields were not at full strength, nor did they have the Astronomicon to guide their navigator. He notices that there's been a change in her demeanor. Her faith is absolute and unswerving. She stands firm. This is what the Emperor had commanded, and as his servants, they would obey. Faith would be their shield. Now, Dagover tries to protest, but Stern asks if he still believed in her like he had previously claimed, and, more specifically, if he still had faith in the Emperor. He hesitates before answering, but eventually tells her that he does. Despite his hesitation, the order was given, and the Iadex Ferox prepared for its unprotected plunge directly into the heart of the most violent warp storm ever encountered by mankind. At this point, the story changes perspective, and we find ourselves on the other side of the rift on the Forge world of Severitas. Here, the Sisters of Battle from Stern's original order, the Order of Our Martyred Lady, were locked in a desperate struggle for survival against overwhelming waves of chaos cultists in the streets of a planet-wide city. Drawn in by distress calls over the Vox, warning of a chaos invasion, the Sisters had deployed, expecting to defend a loyal population. But it was a trap. There were no innocents to save. The entire world was corrupted. Their ship had been destroyed in orbit shortly after planetfall, cutting off any chance of reinforcements. Now, they were forced to navigate the ruined manufactories of a city controlled by heretics. Led by Canoness Commander Macrina, the Sisters were attempting a retreat towards the Cathedral of Saint Thecla the Unyielding, a defensible position on high ground. As they advanced through the streets, they came under constant fire. The cultists used the elevated catwalks and enclosed structures of the manufactorums to launch deadly ambushes. The vehicles were lost, units became isolated, but Macrina held the line and drove her sisters onward. At one point, the heretics detonated charges in nearby facilities, unleashing a tidal wave of molten ore that flooded the streets, incinerating everything in its path. Flaming shrapnel ripped through the Sisters. Many were burned, crushed, or torn apart. The losses were severe, but still, they pressed forward. They could hear the sound of Chaos tanks growing louder and closer, indicating the tightening of the trap. The streets ahead were too narrow for their vehicles, and the only other paths open to them were known killing fields. To stay was to die, but so too was to move. For the Adeptus Sororitas, the decision was simple. They would not run. They would not yield. This was where they would make their final stand against an entire world. At the head of the street, a corrupted tank appeared, flames belching from the spines that covered its hull. Then, before they could see it clearly, the tank exploded. A beam struck it from above, a beam of something far purer and more lethal than light. The flash lit up the gloom of Severitas, turning the vast bulks of the Manufactorums into negative images. The tank erupted, its cannon flying end over end to embed itself in a nearby complex. The impact set off a chain of explosions through the building, incinerating the heretics and their firing positions, their triumphant cries turning into screams of terror. Above, a Valkyrie gunship roared into view, bearing the stylized eye symbol of the Inquisition. It launched 2 Hellstrike missiles into the cultists and turned its multi-laser on them. One after another, more searing beams of energy tore from the sky, its killing power striking again and again, each one tearing through the cultists' cover and detonating their tanks. In desperation, they seemingly forgot about the sisters entirely and turned their attention skyward to the source of their terror. The Battle Sisters at first couldn't see what the cultists were shooting at, but eventually, the smoke cleared enough that they could make out a blinding sphere of crackling energy high in the sky, with the silhouette of a woman inside. They reasoned it was most likely a loyalist psyker, but the abilities she was demonstrating were far beyond anything that had been sanctioned. One of them described the display of power as a star that descended to the surface of Severitas, annihilating the foes of the Emperor with coronal storms. Now, despite the rescue, the presence of such an obscenely powerful witch, combined with the Inquisition, makes all of the Battle Sisters feel incredibly uneasy. Eventually, the screams of the cultists died away, and with no enemies left to kill, the Valkyrie touched down nearby, and the figure descended. The woman's cloak and white hair billowed in the wind, her face was scarred from countless battles, and her armor was marked with the red and black livery of the Order of Our Martyred Lady. But she was clearly a psyker. All of the sisters looked confused. None of them recognized her, except for one, Macrina, the only one amongst them old enough to have seen her alive. She looked on at the woman with both disbelief and utter hatred. Ephrael Stern, she spat. They may not have recognized her, but they all knew that name. They all knew the judgment rendered against her by the Inquisition and the shame her memory had cast over their order. Cultists, though abhorrent, were weak-minded civilians tempted away from the light of the Emperor. Stern, however, embodied the term heretic with much more awful significance. There were no words that could encompass the full scope of her treachery. As one, all of the sisters trained their weapons on her. From the Valkyrie emerged Dagover, stepping forward to intercede in the confrontation before somebody pulled the trigger. He wondered if Stern had thought about how this reunion would go. She was seeing her sisters for the first time in more than a century. She must have known it would begin this way. He wondered if that made it hurt any less. Whatever emotional agony she was suffering, she had submerged it. Dagover's mind in this moment is still reeling from their trip through the rift. He struggled to recall what even happened. By all accounts, his failing ship should have been destroyed the moment they breached the warp storm. By placing his faith in Stern's faith, he had committed himself and his crew to an act of utter madness. But that hadn't happened. Somehow they had survived. The worst part of the whole thing was the memory of what he had felt during the journey. He felt tiny, insignificant, as if Stern was the only thing that mattered. A power had determined that she would pass through that enormous storm, and so it had seized the ship, parted the ocean, and dragged them through to the other side. The entire experience had been, at the very least, deeply unsettling. Back in the moment, Dagover asked the sisters to lower their weapons and presents himself to Macrina and the commandery. She greeted him with suspicion and scorn. She knew who he was. She had heard the rumors about his ties to mutant Astartes like the Black Dragons, and she did not hide her distaste. He insists that whether or not this was true was ultimately irrelevant. All that served him were servants of the Emperor, but that was besides the point. She may not like him, she may not like his methods or what he represented, but as a Lord Inquisitor, she would respect his authority. Dagover goes on to argue that Stern is not corrupted, but instead, she has been chosen, pointing to the miraculous survival of his warp ship across the Great Rift, made only possible by Stern's presence. He tells them of all of the miracles he has witnessed with her, all of the great acts of Sister Superior Stern. He asked them if they had any doubt what would have happened this day without her intervention, an intervention only made possible because the Emperor had willed it. The conversation, or more accurately, debate, continues to go back and forth between them for quite some time. Throughout, Dagover chooses his words incredibly carefully, all building slowly to the idea that Stern might be more than just a warrior. Eventually, he puts a name to it. He pointed at her and called her a saint. Now, up until this point, Stern has remained as still as a statue. Her head is down, her arms are out, palms up in supplication. But when she hears Dagover call her a saint, she snaps to attention, her head whipping in his direction, her eyes flashing with righteous anger. She stated that she made no such claim. She was a psyker, tainted by the warp. She warned him not to blaspheme in her presence again. He tells her that he was her witness, and he made the claim for her. She replied that she was nothing more than a servant of the Emperor, and all she sought was to do his will, fighting in his name wherever that will took her. What she doesn't realize here is that Dagover knows all too well that her humility is only strengthening his argument. The idea was radical and deeply unsettling for the sororitas here, especially for Macrina, who wrestled with her doctrinal instincts and what she had just witnessed. The other sisters remained suspicious, but they were visibly shaken. Dagover could see that doubt was flickering in their eyes. Some of them looked on at Stern with awe, despite themselves. Macrina breaks the tension by changing the subject and tells them of the cathedral they were heading towards, which was a fortified position. Stern asks if she would allow her to eradicate any heretics that stood in her way. Macrina didn't declare Stern forgiven nor trusted, but she would allow her to fight alongside them. For now, at least. Stern flies off ahead of the group to scout ahead and offer aerial support. The trip to the cathedral is kind of uneventful, and they do eventually get there, though cathedral was hardly an accurate name for it. It was more of a massive fortress, with 500-foot walls covered in turrets and gun emplacements. As they all settled in, Stern took for herself a humble cell beneath the fortress to serve as her quarters. Though the canoness had not attempted to imprison her, likely understanding the futility of such an act, Stern respected her and her sister's discomfort, and thus sought to minimize her presence amongst them as much as possible. She would not impose herself. If she was to earn her way back into their good graces, she understood it had to be on their terms. From her cell, she could hear the muffled sounds of another attack beginning nearby, but she wouldn't dishonor her sisters by rushing first to the battlefield. She understood that they would summon her when she was needed. While she waited, she meditated and prayed for guidance, all the while the visions of the all-consuming nothing growing in strength and frequency. Whatever it was coming closer. At one point during her meditation, she ends up getting visited by Sister Clavia, who wanted to tell Stern that she wasn't alone, that she and the others among them believed in her. Stern felt a profound sense of gratitude for these words she had never expected, but she told Clavia that she hoped she didn't believe her to be a saint. Clavia shook her head and replied that she didn't, and clarified that she believed Stern was loyal, that she wasn't a heretic. The two women end up spending some time together. Stern tells her of the nothingness she has seen in her visions and the danger she believes it represents, while Clavia filled her in on everything that had happened in her absence, including the resurrection of Guilliman and the launching of the Indomitus Crusade to reclaim Imperium nihilus, which is what they call the place that Stern had come from, as Stern had never actually heard that name before. After this, Stern joins with Macrina and Dagover in the vestry of the cathedral as they assessed maps and the failing Vox units. Stern stated that if they could not make contact with the Iadox Ferox, then Dagover's greatest weapon was lost. She also goes on to affirm bluntly that even if they could escape, leaving Severitas in the hands of the ruinous powers was unacceptable, a sentiment the canoness agrees with. Stern's able to ascertain that the enemy is more than just a chaotic mob. They were too organized and must be hiding a commander that's incredibly powerful. If the individual is able to obscure the nature of an entire planet and shut out all calls for aid. Macrina agrees with this, but ends up lashing out a bit. She states that that may be true, but searching the entire planet for such a command structure was impractical. Stern proposes an alternative, aerial reconnaissance, just her and Dagover, but she insists that they would not abandon the cathedral. The canoness agrees, and a little while later, Stern takes flight, moving through the ashen skies of Severitas, scanning enemy fortifications, Dagover following behind in his gunship. As she headed east, she saw evidence of heretics massing. The forges were still active, and the streets were filled with bellowing cultists. In the distance, she spotted a strange light, an unnatural aura hovering over a far-off plateau. She attempted to fly closer to get a better look, but a massive explosion consumed a manufactorum complex nearby. Stern was caught in the debris cloud, disoriented and choking on the thick, gritty air. As the dust cleared and she looked down, she witnessed something terrifying. The reanimated corpses of Sisters of Battle, each grotesquely mutilated and fused with warp-spawned corruption. Their voices were dual-toned parodies of prayer and wailing. The profound mockery of the sacred dead took her breath away. Worse still, they were joined by legions of demon engines and other mechanical horrors. Before she could react, Dagover's gunship was attacked by a Helldrake. Stern unleashed silver fire in defense, but it was too late. The Valkyrie fell, pinned between its jaws, and the undead sisters below fixed their eyeless gaze on Stern. They pointed at her and screamed. She suddenly found herself engulfed in a wave of psychic torment. Grief, judgment, and fury crashed over her like a soul storm. Then, flame and hate enveloped her completely. From her perspective, the world disappeared in a sun of pain and the screams of the dead. So, up until this point in the book, pretty much every chapter has been told from Stern's perspective. But now that we have a couple extra characters with the Sisters of Battle held up in the cathedral, it starts kind of shifting back and forth between them. Seeing as this is an abridged retelling of the story, mostly focused on Stern's journey, we're gonna stick with the chapters that focus on her. But just know that in the background, all of the undead and mechanical abominations that she's seeing have been marching towards the cathedral for another attack, and after she falls unconscious, the attack begins. So just know that during the next couple of chapters, there's a big old battle happening in the background. Honestly, the most relevant thing to Stern's story that takes place in these chapters is that a little bit before the fighting actually begins, there's a conversation between Macrina and Clavia that indicates the idea that Stern is in fact a saint is becoming something they're finding harder and harder to deny. She fell through flame and psychic torment, overwhelmed by the demonic song of the risen sisters. The ruinous powers whispered promises of twisted sisterhood, a mockery of the bond she once shared with the Adepta Sororitas. But Stern cried out in defiance and invoked the Emperor's name with holy conviction. This affirmation halted her fall, and once more she took into the air. Radiant with sanctified psychic energy, Stern became a spear of faith. Her power seemed stronger than ever before. She tore through the firestorm and destroyed a massive demonic forge construct, reducing it to a collapsed wreck. Her moment of triumph was interrupted as the Song of the Dead Sisters focused on her, overwhelming her defenses. She crashed to the ground, surrounded by the grotesque revenants. They embraced her with blades and warped echoes of kinship, stabbing her body and spirit alike. She realizes with awful clarity here that these grotesque mockeries of the Sisters of Battle were what so many had viewed her as for over a century. She was on her knees and bleeding, but she wasn't out yet. She rose again to her feet and declared herself the wrath of the Emperor. She unleashed a psychic vortex that swallowed many of the risen, then cleaved a second walking forge engine in half with a blade of holy flame. Her voice thundered in righteous condemnation. "You are nothing," she yelled. Yet the emotional toll on her was immense. The monster's resemblance to her fallen sisters cut deeply, even as she annihilated them. But that very pain affirmed her humanity. She was not one of the damned. With the battlefield momentarily cleared, Stern looked over and saw Dagover's downed Valkyrie. The Helldrake mounted atop it, tearing into it like a wild animal. She spotted Dagover crawling out of the wreckage, thankfully out of sight of the great beast. She flew to him. He was in rough shape, but he was alive. The movement caught the Helldrake's attention, and in response, Dagover raised his plasma pistol and fired a single shot, hitting it in the eye. It howled in anger and reared over them. Stern struck it with a beam of energy, causing it to launch itself into the air to escape. She flew up and intercepted it in a mid-air clash and battled the beast in the sky. Eventually, she managed to emerge victorious by stabbing it in the neck, and with a burst of blinding energy, its head ripped free from its body, as if her sword had been dozens of times longer than it actually was. She returned to Dagover, who confirmed his suspicions. This entire portion of the enemy force was aimed at stopping her. But when he urged her to press eastwards and destroy the army, Stern refused. Her priority now was returning to the cathedral to protect her sisters and to ensure that none of them fell into the enemy's hands again. She insisted that she was not just a weapon, but a servant of salvation for all, even Dagover. Together, they headed back west, cutting through heretics. Stern rejoined the front line, where the Order of Our Martyred Lady battled overwhelming forces. She noticed that although slain sisters no longer rose, the heretics were attempting to drag the bodies of the fallen away. Realizing the risk of more twisted resurrections, Stern called out to her sisters, demanding they leave the risen to her and to get back. She dived into the swarm of undead sororitas and incinerated them in a storm of psychic flame. After the battle was over, Stern returned to her cell beneath the cathedral. She was wounded, but there wasn't time to recover. It's at this point that she's visited once again by Clavia, but the conversation this time is quiet and intimate. Clavia is haunted by pain and doubt, and has struggled with the horror of what she witnessed. Stern assured her that the corruption had come for the fallen sisters after death. They had not turned. None of them bore any shame. Though Clavia says she accepts these words as the truth, Stern sensed that it was more comfort than conviction. Soon after, Canoness Macrina announced that another attack was imminent. In the vestry, Macrina, Dagover, and Stern discussed their next move. Macrina believed they were in a stalemate, but Dagover disagreed. The plateau to the east was clearly the enemy stronghold, and their recent assault had been a targeted attempt to destroy Stern specifically, and it had failed. However, a new wave of demon engines threatened the cathedral. Stern declared it was time to finish what she had started. She proposed to go alone to the enemy stronghold and confront their true adversary, who she now believed was likely to be a powerful master of possession, due to his ability to both reanimate the dead and maintain mass control over the demon engines. Dagover proposes a joint advance, but Stern insists she had to go alone. A full army would be too slow and too vulnerable to attrition. Her speed and mobility gave her the best chance to reach the heart of the threat. She assured Macrina that the Order's stand at the cathedral remained crucial. It divided the enemy forces. The sisters' position would be stronger holding ground and only having to deal with half the enemy. Dagover asks her, what of her? Will her position be stronger alone? She replies that that was irrelevant. It was necessary. It was what she had been called upon to do. Now, in the following chapter, we get another perspective shift, but this time it shifts over to the main villain, who we finally get a good look at. His name is Varric Gar, who, as Stern theorized, is a master of possession from the Wordbearer's Chaos Space Marine Legion. He hadn't just been conquering this world through his armies, but more specifically, through faith. In his journeys, Varric Gar had spread chaos cults to dozens, if not hundreds, of different worlds, but Severitas was his masterpiece. Here, he had slowly spread the influence of the Chaos Gods until the entire world had given itself over to the ruinous powers. He was using faith and belief as a power source. Although the population of this world worshipped the Chaos Gods, they saw him as their intercessor, and thus all of their prayers and beliefs funneled into him by proxy. As a conduit of unholy faith, he had become immensely powerful. He was able to warp reality around the entire planet, let alone create and control armies of demon engines and hordes of undead sisters. He had mixed feelings about Stern. On one hand, she was a direct threat to everything he had attempted to accomplish, but he also recognized that the two of them were alike. What's more, he believed she was the one prophesied to stand against him. So as much as he should have hated her presence here, he was reveling in it. He didn't just want to kill her, oh no. He wanted to break her. He wanted to corrupt the incorruptible. As night fell, Varric Gar walked the fortress ramparts, pondering to himself the setbacks of the day and ultimately labeling them as insignificant. If victory did not come today, it would come tomorrow or the next day. The delay simply allowed him to savor the slaughter a little bit longer. However, not everyone under his command shares those views. Warpsmith Crescent Pack confronted him, angry over the failure of the previous efforts. He believed the Master of Possession was toying with his prey, that the sisters should have been wiped out days ago. He demanded a greater response against Stern. Though at first, Varric Gar dismisses him, he does eventually allow Pack to unleash a mass of demon engines in a renewed assault. In truth, Varric intended this wave to weaken Stern ahead of a greater trap. The fortress, like everything else on Severitas, was an instrument of his will. He raised his hand and gestured out over the balcony, down to the thousands of cultists below at the base of his fortress. He had given them faith, and now he demanded it back. His jaws opened in the ecstasy of power as he seized the strength of collective belief for himself. From the Cathedral of St. Thecla, Stern rose into the sky, shining like a silver star as she began her final flight towards the plateau. Below her, the cultist and demon engines launched a massive new siege. Though tempted to aid her sisters, she realized that stopping the enemy at its source was the only hope for victory. Pain and guilt tugged at her, but she flew on, strengthened by the realization she truly saw the Sisters of Battle as her own. As she neared the plateau, the atmosphere changed. A deep and ominous stillness replaced the chaos. To her shock, she found the base of the cliff clogged with corpses. Thousands of heretics had seemingly been drained of life and reduced to husks. The very air seemed to pull at her soul. Whoever this figure was powerful enough to drain the life force from every heretic for a span of miles. The raw power of such an entity had to be immense, and she wondered if there was any true hope of defeating them. Atop the plateau, Stern found an absolutely enormous fortress, a monstrous fusion of desecrated chapels, forges, and demon flesh architecture, some 2 miles in width and half that in height. She flew closer to the hideous construction, power sword drawn, aiming for its crown, where the master of possession was sure to be. But then, to her horror, the fortress turned with abominable life to greet her. The entire thing was alive, an absolutely colossal demon engine. It roared in challenge as it began to tear itself free from the ground. Stern tried to shoot straight up, racing for freedom, but the fortress was too large and too quick. With rockcrete and metal screaming and grinding like a mountain rockfall, its terrible embrace came for her. Talons 100 feet long slammed together and seized their prey. She awoke a little while later, shocked to be alive. She found herself pinned 10 feet high in the air within a vast red-lit chamber within the fortress, immobilized by warped stone and iron that pulsed like living muscle. Her sword Sanctity remained in her grip, but it too was bound. She could not move, and her psychic powers were suppressed by the sorcery infused into the walls. The chamber was dominated by circular iron platforms leading to a central dais, where 2 word-bearers stood, Crescent Pack, the warpsmith, and above him, the one Stern had come to face, Varric Gar, master of possession. He commanded the room like a dark monarch and announced himself with theatrical flair, proud to have captured the infamous Ephrael Stern. He tells her not to be surprised that he knew who she was. Her name had been whispered many times throughout the halls of nightmares, invoked by heretics and demons alike. There were many who sought her, even old enemies like Ahriman of the Thousand Suns. He walked towards her and looked up, saying that he might know her name, but what he didn't know was what she was. To that she spits and said that she is his bane. Stern remained defiant, calling him traitorous filth. Gar mocked her powerlessness, but beneath his arrogance, Stern sensed frustration. As she struggled and prayed silently to the God Emperor, Stern felt the return of the nothingness, the monstrous void she had glimpsed before. It pressed down on her soul closer than ever. In response to her display of faith, Varric Gar erupted in anger, pointing a finger at her accusingly. He claimed faith itself was what had captured her. The collective belief of millions in the true gods channeled through him, giving life to the fortress. The faith of an entire world made manifest. In response to this declaration, the walls began to tremble. The fortress rocked violently from side to side as the entire structure rose up and began to walk. She ignored his rambling, constantly repeating a mantra to the Emperor under her breath. Varric's obsession intensified. He insisted her presence was not coincidence.
You are a being of faith, misguided though it is, and you have come here now to my planet, to my monument of faith, where your sisters of faith have come too. This is far beyond chance. You agree, I'm sure.
He offered her a hollow temptation, a place by his side and a path towards true revelation. He tells her that the reason she's here must be because she doesn't understand what she is. But she was a revelation, and there was so much more they could explore together. All she had to do was abandon her impure faith in the Emperor that had been blinding her to the truth. Stern ignored him, praying silently. Theatrically, he turned to his warpsmith to give his input, but the warpsmith just said he wanted her destroyed. Eventually, Stern looks up at him and asks him quite simply, "Why haven't you killed me yet?" Gar hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. He claimed she was a prize, a future saint of chaos to demoralize the Imperium. But in that hesitation, no matter how brief, Stern saw the truth. He couldn't kill her. He had tried, and he had failed. This understanding sent new strength coursing through her veins. She clawed against the sorceress bonds imprisoning her, declaring she would not be held. The walls began to crack, and she could feel her bindings beginning to loosen. In response, Varric raised his staff and unleashed a blinding storm of sorcery, trapping her in a vision beyond the material. Though her body remained immobilized, the room from before was gone, having been replaced with a warp-born tempest. The storm howled, both with the raw lightning of the Immaterium and its hatred of her. Demons of all four Chaos Gods materialized to attack and tempt her, each with its own twisted promise, prophecy, pleasure, rage, or contagion. Whenever one of them tried to touch her, they immediately burst into flames. They couldn't harm her, but they would not retreat. Though she could not move, Stern fought back, not with weapons, but with pure, unflinching faith. She projected a searing wave of sanctified belief that burned the demons away. Yet, they kept coming. She sent out wave after wave of energy, but the demons were endless. They surrounded her. The song of chaos wanted her for its own and sought to break her resolve. Through this den, Varric voice cut through the storm like a whisper in her ear. He taunted her. He told her she could not withstand this forever. What's more, there was no time left. At this very moment, her sisters were dying, and with every subsequent moment she resisted, another soul was lost. He mocked her faith, her uncertainty, her pride. He offered revelation, not as lies, but as twisted truths designed to worm into her doubt. Stern was momentarily shaken. The nothingness, the mysterious, looming threat she had sensed for so long, drew closer and closer. He told her that it was true she had been brought here for a reason. She was brought here to see her sisters, those who had cast her out, destroyed. Only then could she be truly free. Could she be what she was always meant to be? Although she's resisting him, some of his words are cutting through to her. She wonders if her pride in thinking herself as the Emperor's chosen had been misplaced. Had she been following his will or inventing it? She continued to pray to the Emperor, asking for guidance, for him to show her his will. Varric mocked the silence that she received in answer, taunting that unlike hers, his gods were present and they did speak to him. He delivered his final temptation.
You were wrong about everything. You were cast out so you could be reborn. Your suffering is your awakening. You are here to understand who you truly are.
He promised revelation, but Stern clung to her prayer, even as his words cut like glass. Even as demons sang her into despair, she reached beyond all of that. And then, suddenly, with dawning, beautiful clarity, she finally understood. If she was here, it was because the Emperor willed it. She had not come to be embraced by her sisters. She had come to save them. She was not on Severitas to call to the Emperor and pray for his answer. She was his answer. She could not see his will because she was his will. She was his sword, and she was his judgment that had come for Varric. The realization exploded within her. Her roar was the thunder of judgment itself, and the holy wrath now erupting from around her dwarfed the storm. It was pure, holy terror incarnate. The chanting of the demons turned into screams. They tried to retreat, but there was no escape for them. Both they and the storm burned. Varric shrieked in rage and pain, and the sacred, purifying, unforgiving fire of the Emperor was everywhere, radiating from her being. An execution and a sun. She tore at her bindings, metal and rock creaking, ripping apart like rotting muscle. She freed herself and dropped to the floor, fire and light radiating from her. The warpsmith attacked, but Stern severed his mechadendrites with a burst of lightning from Sanctity before decapitating him. Varric Gar retreated to the top of the dais, summoning a psychic maelstrom from the warp. The fortress belched flame, the chamber glowing red hot. A cyclone of warp energy formed, and the roof iris opened. From above descended a pillar of dark light, fed by the spiritual energy of the entire population of Severitas. Stern tried to fly after him, but the wind and heat were overwhelming. Varric Gar ascended, consumed by power, shouting that the faith of billions was his to command. The fortress shifted its form again, rising into a twisting, living tower that mirrored the Pillar of Faith. He became the center of a planet-wide cyclone of belief, absorbing the worship of every corrupted soul. The city and its husks were drawn into the storm, causing the fortress to violently grow and change shape. The twisting structure screamed with the throats of tens of thousands as the entire mountain twisted upward in unholy agony. Stern attacked again and again, both with her powers and her bolt pistol, but everything she threw at him was seemingly effortlessly deflected. The dome of energy shrunk, trapping her, the power of the entire planet converging on a single man. The Master of Possession laughed.
You should have accepted your fate. The faith of one is nothing to the faith of all.
Yet she was here, and she was the Emperor's will, the faith of one. Varric Gar fed on the faiths he created, and she saw.
You wield the faith of others. They are not your own. You created a lie because your faith is weak.
She arrowed down again, her course sure and true. This was not a war of the faith of one against the faith of billions. It was one faith, strong, pure, and absolute, against a fractured one.
You doubt!
She roared. Her accusation hit Varric Gar with the force of a sentence passed. Stern saw the fissure in the pillar of flame, the flaw in the construction of belief. She shot through the cyclone and plunged Sanctity into the skull of the traitor. In his final second, before the night erupted with annihilating light, Varric Gar faced the monster of judgment and screamed in terror. In the silence following the cataclysm, Inquisitor Dagover walked alone down the broken hill of St. Thecla's Cathedral, his optics still dazed by the nova-bright light that had ended the battle. Behind him, the Battle Sisters marched in tight, battered formation. Less than a third remained. Their banners fluttered in the ash-filled wind. Dagover kept his distance. The destruction was staggering. Severitas, once a world-spanning hive city, had been reduced to a torn wasteland. It looked as if giant hands had seized the earth down to the bedrock and twisted it up, dragging it high and then hurling it down. The plateau where the Chaos Fortress had stood was now a shattered crater. The light that had brought silence, the light Stern had unleashed, had ended everything. Dagover could not process what she had done. The enemy commander, a being who had twisted an entire world, was destroyed by Stern. The idea of somehow controlling her or guiding her now seemed ludicrous. What was she truly? For the first time in his entire life, Dagover felt genuine, soul-deep terror, not of death, but of pure holiness. He turned away. He wouldn't wait for her. If he remained near her, he feared, he would be consumed by her gravity. Vox contact had resumed. He would call for a Valkyrie and leave. He did not look back. Elsewhere, Stern appeared on the horizon, staggering towards her sisters. Her body was torn and bloodied, armor gouged and scorched. Eclavia rushed to meet her, embracing her before dropping to her knees. The other sisters followed suit.
No,
said Stern.
No, sisters, my sisters, you must not. Please stand.
When they would not, she knelt herself before Macrina. Clavia watched, holding her breath. The canoness hesitated, uncertain. It was not suspicion that held her back, though. Clavia could read her face plainly enough. It was awe. Then, tentatively, she asked Stern to rise, and embraced her too. Stern wept, and then she fell, and she did not move. In the epilogue of the story, we find Stern staring out of the viewport of the strike cruiser Iron Penitence, eyes fixed on the void ahead. This new location was where fate had willed that she would finally encounter the Great Nothing. But how it would ultimately manifest still remained to be seen. Stern no longer doubted her path. She and the Emperor's will were one. Her wounds had healed, though the scars and lingering pain from the battle remained, a reminder of her taint and a safeguard against the prideful sin of believing herself a saint. Nonetheless, she finally knew her purpose, all doubt having evaporated. With the death of Varric Gar, the warp interference that had once isolated Severitas had lifted. Canoness Macrina was able to send word to Battle Group Kalides of Fleet Primus, and the Iron Penitents had arrived to rescue the survivors. Stern's presence had triggered heated debate amongst the fleet's commanders, but it was Macrina's leadership and the testimony of the surviving sisters that had earned Stern an audience. With reluctance, the fleet even agreed to alter its course and follow her instincts. Macrina joined her at the viewport. They were far away from any star, deep in empty space. The nearest system, Zendu, was a mere speck of light. There was a moment where Macrina wondered aloud if there was something specific they should be searching for. But before she could finish the thought, the nothing finally arrived. The void outside the viewport did not visibly change, but a wave came down on the ship. A deluge, a weight, a spiritual suffocation so absolute and heavy that the ship might have been broken upon the bottom of a planetary ocean. For long moments, Stern thought she was blind. She did not know if she stood or fell. She had no voice. There was no sound. There was only the arrival of the all-conquering, all-consuming blackness. Warning claxtons throughout the ship began blaring, and reports came in that the navigator and astropathic choir were screaming in pain and madness. Stern regained her senses and forced herself to breathe. Around her, the bridge crew was struggling. Macrina was standing, but just barely. Officers crawled upright as if drowning in lethargy. The Auspex officer reported no structural damage, but if that was the case, then what was happening? It was as if an army of pariahs had infested the ship. But this was far worse than anything a human psychic blank could have conjured. It was complete and total suppression, a psychic annihilation. Stern turned and rushed down the deck towards the astropathic choir, and was shocked to realize that she was able to move like this when everyone else seemed like they were drowning, whether they were a psyker or not. It was as if she was sprinting across the bottom of a great ocean. She entered the astropathic choir's vaulted chamber and saw agony incarnate. The psychers had collapsed. The choirmaster was dying, mouthlessly sounding pleas. The astropaths writhed and clawed at the air, drowning in invisible depths. Many lay in silent torment. Others screamed in horror. For them, it was as if this was the end of all things. The cataclysm was here. The great nothingness had come. But Stern still stood. She wondered how she could possibly fight this. If whatever this thing was able to cut off the warp itself, and she couldn't use her psychic abilities, how would she combat against it? But she felt no pain. She had run when others couldn't. She felt the suffocating blankness, yet she did not feel helpless. And then, oh so glorious, Stern gasped as the vision began. It started with light, gold and shimmering. It limned the edges of everything around her, and it came from her, from deep inside, from her soul, from its very core. No, that was wrong. The source was something even more profound. It spoke to her soul. The light grew, and with it came thunder, the thunder of the birth and death of stars. The light turned into the lightning of nebulae, and it was still gold, purest gold, the gold of a throne. The thunder was a voice too great for sound, too vast for words, though words formed in her mind, words placed by a force that was sanctity itself.
Be thou my sword!
The thunder was in her. She was the thunder. She was the lightning. This was the decree of that great will. Stern took a breath. She took hold of the lightning. She grasped the thunder. And as the vision faded, she felt the power, her power, that terrible strength that had always been hers, that she had always believed was the taint of the warp. The astropaths flailed in the dark silence that had befallen them, but she blinked, and lightning flared from her eyes. Shimmering power ran down her arms. It flashed from her fingertips. Behind her, someone gasped. Stern turned around, the flames of strength racing over her shoulders. Macrina had followed her. The canoness stared at her. "How?" she said. "You too are a psyker." "No," said Stern, awed by the revelation that she had almost perceived when she fought Varric Gar, but which she could not have truly seen and understood until now, here at the coming of the catastrophe. She was not a psyker.
The Emperor protects. The Emperor is my strength.
Faith, her might, her power came from faith, and faith was the terror she brought upon the foes of the Emperor. She took a few steps past Macrina. Now, she said to the unseen enemy, to the author of the nothing, now I am here. Fear me.